Day of a full set of games to look at. So yeah, let's get started. Um, the first game is from Anch, and I'm just gonna give it a second to load, and for us to basically for us to be able to uh, people to all show up before I jump into the analysis. Give it a minute or two, I guess. Um, yeah. So the first game is from Anch, who's from the chess study group. I think it's a great Discord channel. It's awesome and gives basically the users of this channel have given a lot of games that have been super good to look at, super helpful in giving us material to review during these lessons. And in this game, Anch is playing white. I haven't seen this game, but let's quickly go through. Looks like basically a perk. So let's. Interesting. Okay, cool. Um, cool. And it's got the Lee chess notation on it, which is often pretty helpful. So yeah, so here it's a perk opening. White plays e4, black plays g6. White gets center control and fair development, and black gets the quick bishop develop to g7. D6 is also probably going to be played. H3, and overall, this is basically a position that we've seen many times before. We can look in the opening book. I bet, yeah, there's easily 100 games with this opening structure in it, and yeah, I mean it's basically a standard perk modern game where white has a big center and a developmental edge, and basically black will choose the correct time at which to break free of all of the of all of the center control. Basically some type of counter attack that involves pawn moves in the center. White's development is good here, and this is specifically the move that I was talking about. So, black chooses basically black's development is has gone as far as it can go without opening up the position. So black is choosing between uh, black is basically choosing here between uh, c5 and d5 are the two options that can help advance black's position here. Hey, welcome, Pixon. Thanks for joining the stream. Um, yeah, it's good to see you. Uh, so yeah, so black is basically choosing between c5 and e5 here. They're both sort of necessary in order to advance development, and here, h6 is an option too. But out of the opening book, c5 and e5 are the choices, and let's take a look what the eval says as well. Eval advocates c5. But I basically agree with what the opening book dictates, which is just generally uh, you know, try to expand the position because black is going to need to regain at least some space, somewhere between here and the later middle game. So h6 is probably fine too. But the push of e5 or c5 here I think are the most intuitive. So yeah, so h6, bishop takes f6, which is ideal, and I have to think that's probably, yeah, that basically moves the needle in black's direction. White, all things equal, white doesn't really want to trade off his bishop pair here. I think from a positional perspective, bishop e3 and queen to d2 might be a better strategy. Align an attack on h6 and then probably gets countered by king h7. But um, overall, basically things are moving. Things are moving forward. So I that wasn't bishop takes f6 was fine, but I think might be something to consider. But let's keep looking at this. Uh, White is attacking aggressively on the queen side. That is interesting. I do think it's a good idea to get some space, to basically solidify the spatial control and see if it can be turned into a material edge. I think that's a good plan for white. Here, uh, I, this is an interesting idea to try to do that. Um, Maybe I'll run through this one more time. But then we'll I think we can go back to an earlier part of the middle game and assess plans completely. Um, Here, White's doing great. Basically, throughout that tactical trade, Queen H5 hangs the H3 knight, and White capitalizes. Basically deflected this effective basically deflected all of the attacks, which is perfect. Uh, Here, I guess basically White's going to try to come up with an opportunity to you know solidify, basically turn this piece advantage into a win. That's White's objective for the rest of the game. Um, so this is kind of interesting and somewhat dangerous. Black basically has gotten an opportunity to advance on the king side. This H pawn could potentially pose some difficulties for White. Um, it's tricky. Uh, you know, I think White needs to start getting his pieces mobilized and moving towards the king side here. This pawn can definitely be stopped, and the eval says White's up 3 pawns here. But this is definitely something that needs to be dealt with fairly carefully. Um, on A6 and advance your pawn. Maybe. Um, it depends. I'm not sure. The thing about that right here is that it may ultimately just end up with a win of an exchange. It's a good question to ask for sure. Yeah, no, I like the idea. So pawn here, and then rook here and rook here. Um, yeah, which is good. But I think what it's going to turn out to be is this rook sacking for for this pawn, which will ultimately lead White to be basically like an exchange, to have like won an exchange throughout all of that. Um, which could be worth it. White sort of needs to balance the possibility of this pawn queening and the value of the exchange over here. Obviously, an exchange should be like a game-winning advantage. So I think it's a good plan. At the end of the day, Willem. But it's conditional on being able to stop Black's kingside advancement. But overall, yeah, no, it's good. It's good, and it's good. Thank you for asking about it, and it's good thinking. I think that's a really good question in this position. Um, so yeah, so ultimately, this f3 pawn falls, and the knight does as well. Um, yeah, this gets pretty tricky. Um, and interesting. And then white ends up getting a queen. Okay, so it ultimately turns out as a win for white, but I think there's a few things that to like revisit here. Um, it's a very interesting game, but yeah, Willem, that's one thing that we can definitely look at is bishop takes on a6. White's got a big space advantage here. That's white is strong. Um, Bishop c4. I guess I would say probably here. Given that this isn't a bad move. But given that knight or bishop can recapture white's bishop, I guess I would say I wouldn't go too heavily on the idea of bishop takes f6. I think basically at this point white it's an open game, right? So e4 and then against the Pirk is an open game. So the value of a bishop relative to a knight is pretty high. So I wouldn't want to try to trade off the bishop pair if you don't need to. Given that this is more or less just kind of a straightforward trade, I think it's probably better to just play the bishop to e3 and hold on to the bishop pair. Uh, there's many situations where that's not the case. Like, for example, if if or if white had the opportunity to play bishop takes f6 with and double a pawn on the king side, then it's a more difficult question. But here it's basically, you take this, you trade off this bishop, and the knight replaces the knight immediately. So it was really pretty much just a trade of the bishop for the knight, and at the end of the day, that trade is not really super good for white. Uh, but yeah, very interesting. I would say so. After h6, I'd say bishop e3, um, and uh, and yeah, c6, bishop e2, queen a5. And white's basically both sides are trying to get developed. I feel like white has a pretty good position here, largely due to the space advantage that white always gets against modern and flank openings. Um, this bishop's pretty strong, and could potentially generate as an attack. But overall, here I think bishop e3 as opposed to f6 may offer a slightly better alternative for white. Um, After bishop takes f6, we definitely do swing a bit towards equality. I think yeah. So I think white wanted to hang on to that bishop pair, given that trading that bishop off for the knight didn't pose black any immediate problems. Um, uh, so black retakes with the bishop, so it's not as if he completely replaced the knight on f6. Um, d5, a4, b4, and here, it's pretty. I guess I would say, hey, thank you very much for the follow, Cagnes. Cool screen name. Um, but thank you very much for the follow. Um, uh, yeah. So here, white has a huge space advantage. Black's basically evaluated as slightly better, largely because of this. Basically, this bishop is not particularly strong, and it will be difficult to make this bishop into bring this bishop to a situation in which it's more comfortable. D5 I think does cause just basically causes some developmental problems for this bishop. Also, e5 causes developmental problems for this bishop. Definitely some difficulties for white here. Uh, but basically, white comes up with an interesting plan. Um, I don't know if it's the correct plan, but white's gonna try to gain initiative by attacking on the queen side, and spends a few moves doing that. Um, it's an idea. There are grandmaster games where they do things like that, for sure. So I understand that kind of general concept, but here I think it might be better to refocus White's efforts on the king side. Um, the h6 pawn is kind of vulnerable, and just as a whole here, I think basically expansion on the king side might be the best choice for white. Um, there's just not, basically without a king on the side that you're attacking, it's difficult from a standstill to generate a full attack. Like these pawns, you know, this side may be underdeveloped, but it's pretty solid with in terms of where the pawns are standing. There's not too many opportunities to like wedge a tactical issue in there or create any problems. So here, I guess I would say, maybe bishop e2, but knight h2 could be interesting. I guess I sort of lean towards knight h2, and then have f4 in mind to play as an expansion for white on the king side. I think that ultimately this position is already a little bit tricky for white, given that his bishop is not on a productive diagonal. But I do, and as well as he doesn't have his dark squared bishop anymore either. Um, but I still think play should probably be directed towards the king side. One alternative strategy I would say is that it may it's this will be challenging, but I think a different way to execute this queenside attack would be with bishop with a4, and then a combination of knight e2, knight g3, bishop e2, and then push the b4 and c4 pawns. The c4 pawn is the one that can exert the most pressure directly on black's queenside pawn formation. So I think b4, c4, c5 is really where it's at. That would be my recommendation for at least how to execute this attack. But I'm still not entirely convinced that it's the right play. Um, I think white will get chances in this game. Uh, I think maybe knight to e2 here, maybe. But this is a little bit tricky to navigate. Um, Queen takes, and then ultimately black hangs the knight, and white secures a tactical victory. Uh, but I think the place to revisit is actually pretty far back from a positional standpoint. This trade here, uh, basically white has a number of options here. H6 is kind of a move which weakens the king side. If it's a king side attack, it generally tends to weaken if basically the pieces are if the pawns are moved in front of the king on a king side attack, things get a little bit tricky over here. So maybe bishop e3, queen to d2 is a better line of action. Trading this bishop for the knight, um, with just as a trade on to itself, I think is going to create some weaknesses. It's the bishop just isn't worth that knight. I guess I would say. After castles, e5, d5, bishop g7, a4, and it's basically a position where white really could use his light squared bishop, probably to attack the h6 pawn. Um, the eval's already showing about minus 0.75 pawns for black, and yeah, at the end of the day, like that's probably a serious positional disadvantage for white to try to go up against. Um, but it all works out at the end. But that from an instructional standpoint, I think that's probably the best idea. Revisit this bishop takes f6. Uh, I think that this h6 move does prompt a move from the bishop, but it is not bishop takes f6. It's probably bishop to e3. And then after this, the eval basically shifts negative, and uh, here too, I think d5 might be so restrictive to this bishop that I think that's probably worth avoiding. Maybe pawn takes e5, but something that isn't d5. This just gets blocked here, so I would avoid. Yeah, I guess d5 as a move, sort of. Uh, yeah, is it sort of causes some problems. Um, Anyways, very interesting. Queen takes, and yeah, this ultimately trades into a pretty kind of a favorable position. White's up a piece, black gets it back. But overall, I would give just the standard advice for Anch. I would say consider consider. I think tactics training is probably the next step. I think that's where you'll get the strongest returns. But the other thing that you can do is basically is follow that positional guidance. Don't trade off your bishop pair if black can just replace the piece that you took with the same piece. In this case, knight takes f6. Um, yeah, so be a little bit less trade happy, I think, is the conclusion, Anch. But thank you very much for sending me the game. It's very interesting. Please keep sending them. They're always fun to look at. Cool. So let's take a look at another one. Um, this is another game off of Lichess. And let's see. This one ends in a draw. And yeah, cool. So queen takes d4, queen a4, g6, and here white's showing a pretty, basically it's a very early, queen takes d4 in the Sicilian is a rough move. G6, knight c3, bishop b5, and here, it's an early trade. White wins that rook early. Probably a little bit too aggressive for black, but it's an interesting game. Let's take a look at this. Let's take a look at the opening theory behind this opening because I don't particularly know it. Options are queen takes d4 is the third most popular. The most common is c3 and knight f3. These are the three main options. Let's take a look at queen takes d4. Queen takes d4 leans towards equality. Black gets this immediate knight to c6, and the white queen needs to do something to respond to that. Either queen a4 or or bishop to g7. Bishop to g7. We're deviating quickly from theory, but here, I guess the suggested move is queen to d3. But it's an unusual position. I don't know exact. This is something that you could definitely use as a surprise attack to throw black for a loop here. Um, let's just play like a standard opening line. Queen e3, knight f6, knight c3, e6, bishop d2, bishop e7, and overall, basically, it's a position where white has a lot of basically black has a lot of quick development. White has somewhat of a spatial advantage. But in any case, the opening book has really, opening theory has gotten derailed here. So yeah, so it's pretty good for white as a whole. D4, queen takes, knight c6, queen a4, knight c3, and here, the only game in the opening book says knight to d5. The engine says to just develop straightforwardly, but we're in some pretty crazy sidelines here. Queen takes a8, and overall, yeah. Yeah, no. This is pretty interesting. Let's take a look. Yeah, I mean, I should. It would be great to pull up that Grishik game. Maybe I should do that. But this, yeah. So this queen takes d4, knight c6. Uh, yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I'm kind of curious to see if, how white may want to develop his bishop to b2, like with gne2 and then bishop to b2. Hey Cagnus, thank you for joining the stream and thank you for the follow. But yeah, ultimately, I think challenging Black's bishop with the bishop on b2, that could be an interesting move forward. Um, so yeah, knight c3, bishop b5. But I think by this point, it really becomes a very tactically dominated game, and White ends up winning, which is awesome. But I think that a lot of actually this position gets interesting, relatively interesting again. Um, what's going on in this end game? So yeah, so in terms of things to change around here, I just want to get out of the opening and say, the at least the book line. So at least in case, so we're all on the same page, is queen e3, knight to f6, knight to f3, and basically this queen blocks off this bishop. Um, yeah, sure. If you send the game, Cagnus, or you sign up for the slot tomorrow morning, yeah, absolutely. Super happy to look at it. Um, yeah. But this descends into tactics pretty quickly. I'd suggest Queen E3 over Queen A4. But you're in some relatively uncharted ground, so um, it's very interesting, and you're a little bit on your own. Um, so yeah, so let's look at this. Here we're back to equality. So let's think. Yeah. Hey, no. Thank you very much, El Gecko. Thank you all very much for being here. And Cagnus, we will look at that game for you at 10 during the 10 a.m. Eastern time stream tomorrow morning. I've added it to the list for that, and we will look at it then. But yeah, thank you very much for submitting that game, Cagnus. We'll get to it. Thank you for participating. So yeah, so here we're actually back into a pretty interesting endgame position. The chances are sort of pretty equal here. So where are the advantages for black and where are the advantages for white? Um, Rook b7 threatens this h7 pawn. Basically knight take it's white to move here. Just so we know, knight takes f4 leads to hanging this rook. So knight takes f4 is not playable. Um, Basically, white's pawn structure is stronger, and all the pawns are on the opposing color to the black bishop. And all of black's pawns are also on the color opposing the black bishop, so they can't be defended as quickly as if they were on dark squares. Um, so, what's the correct move here? The correct move here. So I guess I would say I want to go into like a 3 or 4 minute analysis of this position. So let's just think about the different advantage. I would say let's focus on exactly this position, and then see where see what possible plans of attack could be. And it's white to move. Uh, so strengths. White's king is much better placed than black's king. Black's king is basically tied onto the edge of the board and can't quickly move into an active or attacking place. White's king will also take a while to get over, to the, to black's pawns, but it's not quite as displaced as black's king is. Um, uh, White's pawn structure is better, one pawn island versus two, and all the pawns are on white, which is something that favors white if black's bishop is black. Um, how should white capitalize here? Um, well, the first thing I think is and also sorry to just so I don't leave it off. The bishop is generally a stronger endgame piece than the knight. Black has many disadvantages, but the main advantage that he has is that he has the minor piece. Um, so, yeah. Right. So yeah, so if you have a bishop, it's better to have your pawns on the same color. Right. Um yeah. I mean, there's an extension of that too, which is or something about I think what Willem said is exactly right. So it's good to have pawns on your own bishop's color in an endgame so that you can effectively defend them. But usually the way that pawns line up against each other, they're spread apart. They're basically aligned next to each other. So in a general situation, especially in a closed game, if your pawns are on white squares in the endgame, that generally means that the opponent's pawns are on black squares. Just because pawns line up one apart from each other in closed positions. Here, things are pretty loose. So, the pawns aren't adjacent to each other. Everything's on white here, which is interesting. So now that we've had this position up for a few minutes, the next move I think is a pretty clear one. Rook to b7. Moving your rook to the seventh when you have the opportunity to is almost universally a good idea. It's even better if the king is on the eighth rank somewhere. But either way, basically the seventh rank is most frequently where all the pawns are. The rook can basically get behind the pawns or attack them to the side, and then when they move forward, the rook can get behind them, like rook b7 threatening g6. It's a pretty good position. So here, g5, and then rook takes h7. I'm not sure g5 is the best move there. The engine says it is, which is sort of interesting. But Yeah, I think you know, basically black has multiple threats that he needs to respond to here since rook b7 was played. Um Rook b7 frees the knight. And remember, it was white to move here, and the knight was threatening the bishop, but couldn't take it because he would lose the rook in that case. So with rook b7, there's a double attack going on. This knight on that bishop and this rook on that pawn, and basically, you know, black can't, you know, especially since it's a bishop and the pawns are on the opposite color of the bishop. It's a double attack, which is going to play out well for white. You know, all the opportunities were either bishop to g3 or g5. Those were the two options that defended the bishop. So you know, let's say black plays g3. Now, you know, white basically has secured a material advantage and is closing in on a win. You know, this looks like a position which still has play, but offers white way better winning chances than black for sure. You know, maybe rook to g7 could be played on the next move if you gets the opportunity. And then in that case, you know, this pawn would be getting attacked and not be easily defended. Maybe black plays e5, rook g7, rook d6, but this is very tricky play for black. Black has to play super accurately to secure even chances of a draw. Um, Also, black's king's displacement over on the eighth rank is really showing you know, as a weakness. So overall, yeah, really interesting end game position here. Taking it from here, you know, the engine sees quickly that it's all, you know, it's a big white advantage. But you know, it still requires some execution, and the way to do that is by playing rook to b7 with a double attack on this pawn and this bishop. That's the best tactical play for white. Um, but yeah, it played out into a pretty interesting and relatively equal position. So yeah, you know, the end game I think is instructive, and yeah, I guess I would say, you know, revisit potentially queen to e3 as the correct move for white. It's less of a displacement than the queen on a4, where a move like c3 it probably becomes necessary. Um, but yeah, overall, very interesting game. Thank you very much for sending that. Yeah, it was cool to see. Good tactic, winning that queen too. That seemed to work pretty well. Um, and even with queen d7, to be honest, you know, black's in a lot of trouble here. But yeah, great tactic. Bishop b6 traps the queen. Nicely done. Cool, awesome. Yeah, thank you very much for sending that game. Please keep sending them in. Interesting stuff. Um, let's take a look at the next one. I'll just pull in an import from Lichess. It's funny. I have to export and import every time out of Lichess because if I try to run them all on chess.com at once, my engine or basically my computer is the processing powers kind of overtaxed. So I have to make sure that I only have one engine open at once, or things get slowed down, then the stream gets laggy. But yeah, so let's play through this. This is the game that Gecko sent us, and yeah, Gecko is playing black, and I'm just going through quickly so we can take a look at it. Um, cool. So here we go. Um, this is yeah, Queen's Gambit declined. B6 looks early here. It's interesting. I don't think that's one of the preferred moves. Here, e3 is also somewhat unusual. You can see basically there's three main moves here: knight f3, um, c takes d5, and bishop to g5. Those are the three options. The names of these: three knights variation, exchange variation, and modern variation. I don't know those names off the top of my head, so I was sort of playing through those just so I could learn them. But yeah, but a distant fourth relative to everything else is e3 here. E3 has some problems. E3 basically, prevents this bishop from developing to the relatively natural bishop g5 square. Now this bishop's probably going to have to go to d2, or maybe b3, or maybe b2. But that move in kind of an unnecessary way, decreases the mobility of the dark squared white bishop. Here, b6 takes things out of theory. There's still a little bit of theory here. C6 potentially, or castles. B6 is an interesting try though. B6 basically is the idea that you're going to move your bishop along this diagonal. I'm not. I guess I would say that that is a plan that has some promise to it. But I feel like if White plays kind of f3, that does shut things down. Although at the cost of having to come up with a less natural progression plan for the knight. Um, anyways, b6, c takes d5 is finally played by White. Knight takes d5. And overall, knight takes, pawn takes, c takes, and yeah, things look pretty good. It's basically things have simplified, and white has continued to have the initiative. Um, I guess I would say, in some ways, this is basically showing equality, which means that black has eliminated the initiative. But b6 is a pretty unchallenging move for white. I guess I would say, it makes I think it makes a little bit more sense to go for earlier development here. The white squared bishop, or white squared bishop's value on the fianchetto here is not super clear to me. Um, it's an idea for sure, but I don't know if it's worth committing the two moves that it requires to develop for it. Um, but it is actually pretty interesting because the normal one of the normal moves here for black is c6. And with c6 having been played, bishop b7 is not something with a lot of value. But if c6 isn't played and that diagonal really is free to the rook, that makes bishop b7 a more interesting and somewhat complicated move. Um, c takes d5 should be fine for black. I think e takes d5 is slightly better here. It basically increases the strength of black's pawn structure. Um, with knight here, this is not bad, but a thing about space advantage in the center, between pawns is that in a place where basically there's a spatial advantage between a pawn placed on the fourth and a pawn placed on the third that are going up against each other. In the absence of this e3 pawn, this d4 pawn would be stronger than this e6 pawn. Um, Basically, that's just sort of a principle in the way that space works in the center. Like, these pawns are sort of going up against each other, right? So, like, if nothing, in unusual position in which there was nothing else on the board, nothing else neither of the pawns could move because the other one would take the other. I want to make sure I explain it right, but basically, if a pawn's on e6 and a pawn's on d4, uh, then and neither is defended, neither can move. So the pawn on d4 can't move to d5, and the pawn on e6 can't move to e5. They're both sort of stuck there. So the value, basically the conclusion of that is that a pawn placed on d4 is favorable to a pawn placed on on e6, and on the other side, a pawn placed on d5 is favorable to a pawn placed on e3. And the reason why it's favorable is because it provides the pawn that's further advanced with the spatial advantage in the center that comes with a more advanced pawn. But attacking wise, they're sort of facing off against each other, and neither can move. Um, so I think here, I would say pawn takes d5 is a better play. It avoids this unfavorable d4 to e6 pawn structure. and instead it winds up in a position where the d4 is facing the d5 pawn, and the e3 pawn is still good for white because it's a central pawn. But yeah, this e3 pawn, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that I would condition it based on multiple specifics to situations. But the pawn on the fourth controls more than the pawn on the third, and neither can move relative to each other in a situation where nothing else is on the board. Uh, but um, but it's sort of a not a possible situation that literally nothing else could be on the board. But that's the fundamental of that idea. If you had heavy pieces behind each of them too, the spatial advantage of the more advanced one would become more obvious. So like if there's a rook behind either one of them, neither could advance, but the one on the fourth would have more center control than the one on the third. Um, yeah, so here pawn takes d5 I think favor is better than knight takes d5. It's going to be two pawn islands either way. Here c6 can be played. And Yeah, this ends up playing out pretty well. I think white actually sort of improves black's by getting that pawn to d5. But it's pretty close to equals. Bishop d7, I think is probably better. Yeah, I think I'd play bishop to d7 here, and the reason why I think is because bishop d7 develops with tempo. Um, bishop to b5 might be coming here too, but you'd respond to that with c6. Developing with tempo, especially against a queen, is probably the most is probably the best idea here. Bishop d7 facing the queen on a4. That gets you free development for the bishop to d7. It sort of scraps this bishop to b7 idea that b6 sort of set up, but bishop to d7 threatening the queen, and black's got a development with tempo here. Um, c6 I would play now. Bishop e6 also makes sense. Um, but knight to d7, knight to d7 is not. I don't think it's as good just because it blocks. It basically doesn't take that tempo that I was talking about, and also it constricts this bishop's development. The bishop probably ends up going to b7 anyways, so maybe it doesn't matter that much. But basically with bishop to d7 here, you deal effectively with the bishop b5 threat, and the pieces are aligned in a more healthy way. I understand like totally that it makes a lot of sense to want to play knight d7 so that you can play bishop to b7. But there's some tactical issues that come up with that with bishop to b5. Now things are getting a little bit tricky. A6 might be the best move. But this threat on this diagonal causes black some problems because black can't black I guess black should probably castle here, but he can't play c6, and c6 is a pretty natural move to be playing. Another thing, black can't actually black can castle. Bishop takes d7, bishop takes d7, and the queen is getting threatened on a4. But what black can't do is he can't play bishop to b7 and then castle. So, like for example, bishop to b7 and castling here hangs the knight, so it's no longer playable. Um, so it's I guess let's go back. Let's go back a second on this. Like, you're choosing between moving the knight to d7 or moving the bishop to d7. And they're both developing moves. So reason one reason why is because this bishop d7 defends and launches an attack on the queen, gaining a tempo. So that's probably the best reason to play bishop d7. But also, knight d7, bishop to b5, and now black can't really comfortably play bishop to b7 anyways. So the concept of like I understand what happened, which is you really wanted to play the bishop to b7 to the fianchetto, or at least that's what I think. That's what makes that's a pretty good explanation for it. And I understand the logic behind it for sure. But but basically, you tactically speaking, with knight d7, you sort of lose at least part of the ability to play bishop to b7. So at this point, it's probably better to just sort of accept that b6 is a move that didn't play out exactly as it could have, and bishop d7 becomes the best attacking move on the queen. Yeah, no, I think that's right, Algecko. I think it makes sense. You've built this. You've taken a move to play b6 and to give your bishop a potential fianchetto. I get it. It makes sense. In the context of the game for sure. But at this point, you have tactical reasons to accept that you know basically to adjust your plan. You have a tactical reason to adjust your plan here, and that's defending with a gain of tempo. Basically developing your pieces with tempo against an attacking queen is like the object in like Scandinavian and that center counter thing we were looking at. And it's sort of a common theme. So I would just say if you have an opportunity to develop your pieces and gain tempo against an attacking queen, that's often the correct idea. Knight d7 develops the piece too. But basically, with bishop d7, you get to defend. The queen has to play somewhere, so you get to develop like two pieces or maybe a piece in this pawn. But play two moves that sort of develop your position. Overall, very interesting. Like this attack is it's considerable. Like this is considerable. Bishop can't develop to b7 here. Um, Here, castling queenside compromises the king's safety. I think there's going to be some opportunities for black with like rook c8, and then like rook c8, c5, pawn takes d4. I think it's going to provide an opportunity to threaten the king on c1. Knight to f6, bishop to d3. But black's better here, largely as a result of black sort of giving up some king safety. This move of this king to this open file is helpful to white, and provides basically a plan for black. This open file is something that I think black can achieve here with rook c8 and c5. So here, black's up almost 2 pawns. Um, but the plan, I think black's best plan here is to try to attack aggressively on the king side. I think black basically needs to quickly attack and doesn't have too much opportunity to be passive. This all trades off fine, so ultimately. And by the way, yeah, so it's a win for black anyways, and it's a good win out of a rook and pawn endgame. But I think just in terms of middle game structure here, if we go back to like here, I think the plan for black here, the best plan is to like play like bishop to e6, maybe queen to d5, and then try to get the rooks onto the c file and attack on the c file. I think the king is vulnerable on c1 with the open file against him. So this to me seems like the time to attack, just from a big picture perspective. Like rook to c8, c5, and c5, and then threats on d4 maybe. But overall, this worked. But I guess the tactical execution here is good, and black ends up winning. Which is all great, and it means you did what you needed to do in the game, which is the biggest priority. But I guess I would just say like the thing to do here is really think about a plan. Like at the higher level, grandmasters have very like sophisticated plans that have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and they know like exactly like what they need to set up in order to start executing the plan and how to execute the plan, and then an ultimate situation that they assess as like being the successful execution of the plan. So here, it is tempting to, I think it makes sense, especially like the early moves, like developing the pieces, makes sense. But I think just if you're sitting at the board here on move 12, you say something like, okay, I really, I'm looking at this position. It looks about equal, but there's a lot of play there. What am I going to do to come up with a plan to execute? And then, in this specific situation, I think White's kind of offered you a route forward that makes sense. His king safety is not particularly good. You have the ability to support pawn moves on the c file and potentially open the c file for one of your rooks, and the combination of and so the plan I think is a good you can sort of do that in this situation. You can say, okay, the king safety is weak. That could be a target for me. I'm gonna play soundly and carefully, but I'm gonna work towards the end of undermining the king's safety on the queen side here, using this open file in my rook. Otherwise, it's hard to sometimes plans become unfocused. Sometimes there's opportunities that arise to win you material that will disrupt your plan, that kind of thing. But basically, if you just but basically, in the early middle game, sometimes it's a good idea just to step back for a second and like think and be like, okay, this is these are the potential targets. This is where my pieces have sort of developed to, and where his pieces have sort of developed to, and based on the vulnerability, each side's relative vulnerabilities and strengths, I'm gonna start attacking the king side here, or I'm just gonna start attacking the queen side here. Um, but those between grandmasters, those are where the time is really spent thinking. I think. When grandmasters make these 45-minute moves, what they're thinking of is where are the vulnerabilities and how do I exploit them, and how do I use that to plan my next 10 to 15 moves. Um, so big picture, I think that kind of thinking might I think this is a good opportunity for Black to kind of go through and slow down for a minute and say the strategic plan here that looks the best to me is probably rook to c8, c5, and exerting pressure on this exposed white king. I think that's there's uh, all of this is good execution, but it seems a little bit unfocused. So I think that formulating a plan specifically after move 12 uh, is is what I think I mean you'd have to speak with one, but I think what a very high level player would do. Um, but overall, very interesting game. I think the biggest, that strategic thing I think is true, but the biggest, sort of one move improvement here I think is this d5, orienting these pawns against each other, and having a more favorable structure than d4 versus e6. Um, but yeah, it played out well, and Black executed well tactically. Got some good like shots in, and won the game in a pretty solid rook and pawn end game. So yeah, I think it's a really good game, El Gecko. No, thank you very much for sharing it with me, and yeah, it's very interesting stuff. Yeah, cool. Please keep sending them. They're interesting and uh, yeah, instructive. Thanks, El Gecko. Cool. Let's take a look at the next one. Um, all right. So this game was from a Met, and yeah, no. Thank you, El Gecko. Really, no. Thanks for sending it in and giving us material to look over. Like, really appreciate you being here, and I'm glad we could get to that. Cool. So here's I think this is called the Philidor defense, right? I always forget. D6 is yeah, Philidor defense. Philidor defense with bishop to c4. Philidor defense sometimes has this cool queen sacrifice. I'm just gonna show you guys. Uh, this this sometimes happens. So like knight to f6 here. Or actually no, sorry. There's basically opportunities for white to sack the knight on e5 here. I forget the move order. I can build. It's not worth building it, but sometimes the Philidor defense leaves to knight takes e5. Yeah, legal mate, exactly. Uh, I was yeah I was blanking on the move order, but yeah, legal mate is a cool thing that can sometimes happen in the Philidor defense, um, as well as a few other places. Um, okay, Philidor. And then the engine is recommending bishop takes e6. Bishop takes e6 is interesting. It does give black doubled pawns early, which is something to consider. And but it also opens up, black's f file potentially for a post castling open rook file. That's the logic usually behind the move bishop to e6 is after you play bishop e7, knight f6, and castles. This rook has a line of attack on white's weakest point on the board. Um, yeah. This is yeah. So this is interesting. So bishop c4, bishop to e6. Um, uh, yeah. No, doubled center pawns are not that bad, especially in the middle game. That's true. It's still like assessed as like a weakness, but it's not as bad as isolated pawns or doubled isolated pawns or isolated pawns somewhere else, double pawns somewhere else. But anyways, what I'm sort of getting at is that um, uh, computers advocating bishop takes e6 here, and the opening book is also favoring bishop takes e6 as the number one move. Um, I don't know. I mean, I I'm kind of curious if on d3, which is d3 is also a playable opening book move, but I'm wondering if the bishop will take on c4 and then white's pawn center's a little unusual. And white's d4 is kind of not that strong. But anyways, it's very interesting. So yeah, so bishop e6, a bishop e6 this early is an interesting way for black to play the Philidor. Um, so bishop, let's just play through bishop takes e6 for a few more moves. D4 captures the center for white and undoubles the pawns. And here the eval is favorable to white. Superior development for the knight, and I think probably cleaner developing lines for his pieces. With bishop to e7, basically the bishop's mobility is limited necessarily in this opening, which is really basically the weakness in the Philidor. Is Black's losing his mobility of his dark squared bishop. It's stuck. So it's something that Black didn't really need to do. And he still can come up with a solid and somewhat cramped defensive position. But the move bishop c5 can no longer be played. So whatever diagonal Black's dark squared bishop ends up on in this opening, it's gonna be weaker diagonal than c5. Uh, Not to say that it's a bad idea to have a cramped defensive structure sometimes, but it's that bishop is the main shortcoming of this opening. I think that's pretty objectively true. Knight d5, pawn takes, and here maybe a4. The knight looks trapped. Um, Black's sort of given white an opportunity to win that knight. Knight takes was forced, and this retreating square for black was only a solid retreat square for one move. So with knight b5, a4 can be played. So I guess yeah, Ahmet. I think all this others and pretty much this looked reasonable. But this is an example of where tactical study would have delivered a pretty close something pretty close to a win here. Black's piece is displaced, and with a4, that piece is trapped. The knight can't go here or here or here or here or here. So overall, uh, yeah. So a4. I think moves like a4 become a lot easier to see if you're doing tactics day in day out. Like, if you're doing if you're doing your tactics, your chess tempo, and your tactics training, you find a4 pretty easily. Certainly after a while of doing it, you find a move like a4 pretty easily, and the knight gets trapped, and you win. You play a4. You play a4 pretty soon, anyways, and trap the knight, which is awesome. But there were opportunities here for. There was a move of opportunity for black to play c6 here, and then you don't lose the knight. So like here, c6, and then the knight has c7 as an effective escape square. Um, so yeah, that's mostly just tactics. Um, White is looking pretty solid. Um, uh, another tactical thing. After pawn takes, I think you probably should play knight to e1. With pawn takes, you open yourself up for attack by the bishop. So a double attack of the bishop attacking the a1 rook, and the pawn attacking the f3 knight. And the combination of those two wins material for black. Um, Black still got some, or white still got some chances here, and ultimately that pawn queens. Um, but uh, but yeah, I guess I would say that that list of moves didn't play out super well for white. A4 and yeah, pretty much this tactic right here creates a problem for white that he can't easily recover from. But he does anyway, so that's a win for yeah, it's a win. A win's a win. But tactical study, I think that's where your returns are. I think learning the openings is good. Learning positional play is good. But in terms of what needs to be learned like the most immediately, I'd just say do an hour of tactics a day for a month, and you'll be a lot. You'll get very good returns off of that for sure. So yeah, I think that's good. Thank you very much for sharing the game, Ahmet. Please keep sending them, and yeah, stick tactics. Tactics offer you the quickest return on your time spent studying, for sure. Yeah, cool. Thanks for the game. Um, on to the next one. Cool. This one was sent to us by Ashish, who's playing white. Um, and white gets good quick development here. It's kind of interesting. The bishop on c4 is somewhat of an unusual placement. I bet there's still lines in this opening, but bishop to c4 is well down the list. Of this is the third most popular opening. The bishop on c4 in the Sicilian is kind of an interesting situation. E6 can be played, and basically blocks the bishop from attacking much on f7. Um, yeah, here I think basically white's I bet the eval is pretty favorable. Eval is a little better for white. Um, you know, I guess I would say keep developing, but don't relieve the tension in the center with a move like e5. I think if you trade off on e5, you're basically trading this e5 e4 pawn for this d6 pawn, and like what we were talking about with the pawns earlier is that this basically you're trading a relatively good pawn that holds the center a lot, for a somewhat less good pawn that holds the center less. Um, so I don't think this is a good. I think leaving the pawns here is not the is a good idea for white. Um, I understand that, like, that holds this knight on c3, but I'd probably play queen f3 here. Um, you know, there may be better moves, but I'd play queen f3. That holds this pawn. You can start, like, moving your knight around if you want to assemble a kingside attack. Just also too, as a general principle in the Sicilian, um, f5 is often the pawn break. Once you get once you're starting to attack, I would say attacking black with the f5 pawn is often a lot more potent than attacking black with the e5 pawn. Especially if your bishop's on this diagonal, f5 provides some attacking opportunities. If it all trades out, f5, pawn takes f5, knight takes, bishop takes, rook takes, and f7 will become a pretty solid point of attack. F5 is the move that basically rips the defensive e6 pawn off of the weak f7 square. So that's an idea. Um, Here, yeah, looks like white's in pretty good place. So basically, what happened is that f7 pawn ended up falling. White had a cool sacrifice here. Uh, Bishop takes. Let's see exactly how this happened. E5. Black missed the hanging e5 here. And then moved knight h7. Um, Black missed the tactic that came off of here, but after knight takes e5, I think he's got material. Um, so yeah, knight h7, knight c6, and yeah, basically pretty solid. Yeah, solid for white. Um, but black missing knight takes e5, I think was pretty helpful here. Um, the pawn break generally comes with f5 and not e5, but yeah. Um, anyways, this tactic ended up playing out pretty well, and yeah, strong outcome. But let's go back just a little bit. Bishop c4 is played in some Sicilians, but can run into some issues with e6. That's just something sort of to know about. Sicilian theory is that e6 can stop the bishop along that diagonal, and sometimes makes the bishop sort of misplaced on that diagonal. It also potentially could come to an attack from that rook on that semi-open file. But yeah, bishop e2 maybe is probably better. Um, but overall, interesting. Knight f6, and then and then here, I feel a little bad in these kinds of situations because what you did worked, right? You got this cool sacrifice uh, and won the game with it. But at the end of the day, like this pawn push is sort of, it's a little early for that. So pawn takes, knight h7, and basically now knight you know basically knight can take e4, or knight can take e5. Black misses it and plays knight h7 instead. But after knight takes e5 here, black's basically got a material advantage and a center advantage, and this pawn's going up against, this pawn is actually a connected passed pawn. Um, but yeah, um, I guess I would say it's great that it worked, and it's led to some very cool tactics. But big picture, the tactics that you want to play are the ones that don't have a good response. Um, uh, Black missing a pretty key hanging pawn here really helped you, and you ended up converting well and winning. But um, you don't want to if possible you don't want to play unsound attacks. Uh, it's hard sometimes, and it's very difficult over the board to know which is sound or unsound. But um, you know, on this e5 move, pawn takes, knight takes, is going to lead to a hanging pawn on e5. Um, but cool. But so I think at the end of the day that that was a little bit not the right that was not the right tactics there. But since we've accepted that now, let's look at how cool this tactic is. So here, knight takes e6. So pawn takes e6 leads to queen h5 and then a checkmate. The only playable move is g6 and the queen takes g6 and then it's checkmate. Cool. So that's option number one. Um, Option number two is bishop takes, and bishop takes is also a pretty serious problem. On bishop takes, the queen takes d1 is the best move, I think, probably. Actually, it's castles. But say queen takes d1, which is what happened in the game. Bishop takes f7, and the king's forced to go either to the left or the right. But the bishop has managed to take this pawn with tempo, and then threaten the king. Basically threaten the king and win. But here, um, yeah, looks. I mean, this is good. White's better. It's a good tactic if it plays out with knight h7. Um, so bishop takes, queen takes, bishop takes, and this in between move, this bishop takes f7 move, basically wins the game for white. The other way, I think bishop takes e6, bishop takes e6, pawn takes e6, leads to black losing his queen. So queen h5, and then either g6 or king d7. But if g6, then just king d7 in the next move. And then white can play the a rook to d1 and skewer the queen. So it's a very good looking tactic if black plays knight to h7. But at the same time, I wouldn't get too stuck on converting those. I think it's pretty much uh, yeah. I think at the end of the day, you really do need to stick to solid tactics. But it's very interesting. Yeah, thank you very much for sharing that game. Um, uh, good tactical sight on knight takes e6. That was pretty crushing. Cool. Let's look at the next one. Um, okay. 1 second. Okay. Uh, okay. Cool. Here's our last game of the night. E5, advanced French. And here, yeah, white wins. Cool. All right. Let's look at this. So bishop b5, queen a5, bishop takes c6, and we're basically out of theory. Um, this defense, this Karo Khan is sort of an unusual concept. Um, uh, Black plays this early c5, and that wastes a tempo. So e5, c5, and bishop to b5 here. Bishop takes c6, pawn takes c6, and um, it's I guess equalish, but pretty interesting because uh, you know This feels like a wasted tempo for black. But white doesn't really have an easy way to exploit it either. Here, the most common move is not bishop b5. It's knight e2, defending this d4 pawn. This is going to end up being similar to a French pawn structure where if white can maintain it, he wins. But um, overall, this gets into a pretty aggressive attacking situation. Um, Knight takes, and rook takes b6, rook b7. Yeah, looks pretty solid. Black's up a piece, but white has this advanced pawn. It's an interesting situation. Um, but this winds up, after basically if black on, uh, allows some very aggressive, end game play here. Let's just see what happened. Bishop b5, bishop d6, g5. And yeah, this tactic here is kind of aggressive. This rook takes c5. Not sure if that was good because it freed the pawn on d4. Um, Bishop to d6, g5, rook to b1, rook to c8. But yeah, kind of interesting. Um, b6 here. Black's still showing a big plus. Um, but e6 is a good move. It offers this pin and basically wins the f7 pawn. Pawn takes f7, and now black has a lot of different things to worry about. F8 queen, leads to a win of an exchange immediately. The white bishop plays c5, and here, white's better. Um, yeah, looks good. Rook a7, rook takes a5. Looks like a win. Um, okay, interesting. Um, but these passed pawns, they get pretty strong. But yeah, let's look. I think this was uh, uh, black. I think this black was the one who was playing this game. So let's look. Knight c6, bishop b5, queen a5, and overall here, pretty. Yeah, I guess I would say fairly strong development for black. Somewhat tricky. Um, Pawn takes b4. But basically, black secures equality, and things are looking all right. Um, the skewer is good. Yeah, let's look. 4c3. 4c3. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Um, c5, I guess, is an opportunity. Yeah, c5, c3. It's the recommended one, I think, is d takes c5, right? Um, I'm not sure, to be honest. This Caro-Kann is weird. I don't play the advance. I play the main line. C5 is strange because you're basically accepting that you're taking two moves to play something that takes one move to play. C3, knight to c6, bishop to b5, queen a5, and yeah, interesting. But c3 does help support. Yeah, let's look at the analysis here. Um, I don't know. No, it looks like after c3, uh, this pawn is up. it's 0.55 for white. Um, yeah, I mean c3 effectively defends d4. That's true. Knight c6, bishop b4, or bishop b5. I don't know. It looks sort of like a French, but with e6 not having been played. Maybe bishop f5. Queen a5 though is sort of a weird move to play here. Queen a5 I guess sort of threatens takes d4, but not really because the knight is pinned anyways. It's interesting though. Um, Pawn takes bishop f5, and yeah, cool. Um, Good skewer. Let's see. Um, b4, pawn takes, queen b6. Um, I don't know. It looks like a fairly equal game. This c6 pawn is weak for black, uh, but white will take several moves to exploit it. Maybe knight b3, knight a4. Unclear. Uh, Bishop b7. Hmm. All right, I'll slow this down. Let's go from the beginning. I got kind of stuck on this opening theory here. Bishop b5, queen a5, bishop takes, pawn takes, and black doesn't really have an obvious move here. I don't know, maybe c4. The engine suggests e6, really transposing this into a French. Um, how is b4 not hanging there? Uh, I don't know. Let's look. Um, doesn't look hanging to me. Oh, now it does. Yeah. Uh, Yeah, right. On here. Yeah, you're right. No, you're right. Queen takes b4 is the b4 is hanging. So um yeah, queen takes b4 capitalizes. Looks pretty strong. I don't know. I feel like black has a better position here. Uh b4 is an unusual move for white to play here, I think. Basically I don't know exactly why. I think white would probably want to be developing in a straightforward way, like maybe with things like I don't know, take c5. I guess that's not developing. Um, I don't know. Uh, Kind of unusual. C4 maybe. It's weird. Knight to a3. Um, but I guess b4 does offer him some spatial, like at least some queenside expansion. It's a really weird, unusual game that I'm not familiar with. I don't think I've played the Caro-Kann much in my life, so um, this early queen a5, this early queen a5 without any immediate threats being sent is interesting, but not something that I'm familiar with. Pawn takes, queen b6, knight f5. Yep, looks pretty much yeah, looks pretty much like a win for black at this point. Black will have to take care of this pawn on b5 now. But here, black basically has a piece to a complicated pawn structure, and the worst case scenario, I think black just sacks the piece back. Um, it's kind of interesting. I play e5. That's my move against e4. Overall, there's it's a stylistic thing. I like open games with lots of tactics. Those are the most interesting for me to play. I guess it's sort of I almost play kind of a classical style with a lot of tactical play. People play things. People play a lot of the Sicilian now. People play the French, which is pretty solid. But I'm most comfortable e4, e5. E4, e5 playing into like the Italian game and Guaco Piano is black is the most interesting for me. So yeah, overall, I guess I would say that's yeah, those that's my strategy. Um, Castles, bishop to c or rook to c1. There's got to be a tactical, yeah. There's got to be a tactical way for black to win this. Um, maybe doubling the or maybe getting the rook to c8. Uh, I think rook to c8 offers some chances. I think no, I don't know. I don't uh the no, I don't know that one, Void. Um, I've heard it's I'm not sure if it's sound or not. But I think I've heard of it. Um, but yeah, let's look at this. C5. Yeah, I don't know. This opening sort of opening confuses me. It's hard for me to believe that this is playable as black. This C6 and then C5, but I guess it's okay. White wastes a similar tempo with E5. Um, Bishop to F5, castles, B4, pawn takes, queen B6, and yeah. Yeah, overall, I mean, this is pretty strong. This ended up playing out well for black, especially with the hanging pawn. Um, I keep missing. How did the knight takes d5, and I guess yeah, I guess let's take a look and see if this knight sacrifice is sound. My feeling is that it's not, but it's still a pretty interesting move for white to play. It leads to this imbalance and these advanced pawns on the queen side here. Black skewers, and then they trade. And then they trade into this. So here, the before picture is black has the opportunity to trade on a4. That's considered to be black's best move. It sort of simplifies things. The b4 pawn hangs. So that's big. The other direction, queen to b6 allows this knight takes d5 sack, pawn takes d5 sack, rook to c6, and bishop to d7. Um, yeah, that's this is a much more complicated position. Before the queen side was basically getting liquidated, right? Full liquidation. Unclear outcome. But here, knight c3, queen takes a4, knight takes, pawn takes, pawn takes, pawn takes, and then yeah, the whites pawns have basically gotten delisted. The issue here is that uh, basically this makes things a lot simpler, if nothing else. Um, Queen to b knight to c3, queen to b6, and then the knight sack. It's a very complicated and double-edged position, and that's probably what white wants here. Bishop to bishop to c4, bishop to b4. I mean, I don't know. I don't know. This position has a lot of play left. I don't think I can do it justice in another minute and a half. But um, the uh, the point is that it's basically very it will probably end up being a win if black sacrifices a pawn for or sacrifices a bishop for a pawn, or maybe two pawns. But black playing king g7 and missing e6 here is sufficient to turn it from basically a win into a loss. So rook takes, pawn takes, and this is this ultimately ends up being white's win. So this is just a quick tactical miss. Um, Black played a very interesting sacrifice. Probably wasn't sound, but it was very complicated and led to a lot of complexity that probably increased White's winning chances. That White knight takes d5 sack. But King g7 here seals the game, and that's pretty much it. Um, yeah, pretty much the end. But overall, very interesting game. It's cool that that White had kind of the thinking to play knight takes d5. Because at the end of the day, I really do think it's sort of responsible for his win. Um, if he didn't play knight takes d5, I don't think he would have won that game. But he did, so that was a good idea. Otherwise it sort of probably would have played into a relatively conservative, somewhat losing game with a neutralized queen side. This position is equal or worse for white. And there's not nearly as much as excitement, opportunity to take the queen or anything like that. So yeah, overall, I think it's a very interesting game. I like the piece for two pawns and a passed pawn sacrifice. Very interesting. I try not to get stuck too much on the opening. This is an unusual one for me. But yeah, ended up playing out into a pretty good position. Castles and it all looks good. So yeah, thank you very much for sending these games, and thank you all very much for watching the stream. I had a good yeah, no, I had a good time analyzing these games, and yeah, thanks. Please keep them coming. Very interesting positions and some definite instructional value. Interesting way to look at a sacrifice, allowing for some pass pawns on the queen side. So yeah, thank you all very much for joining the stream, and yeah, very interesting stuff. Have a good one. Next stream is tomorrow at 10 a.m. And look forward to seeing you there. Thanks. Bye.